Hello, my wolf pack. Charlie Black 20 back again with part 2 of the Miracle of the Andes. Before we went through the background of what happened and what caused this plane to crash in the Andes Mountains in 1972. We will now cover the first 24 hours, followed by the next 9 to 10 days. So, getting right back into it. With the plane crashing at 11,500 feet, they have crashed in one of the most inaccessible parts of the Andes Mountains. Covered in over 100 feet of snow and so unknown that it doesn't even have a name yet. Several of the passengers and crew had been sucked out during the crash. Several more had been killed or injured. And there's chaos all around them. Several of the boys start rescuing whoever they can, pulling out anybody they can. Several of them aren't injured at all, although some of them are just stunned by what's happened. They can't do anything. They're in a daze. And we have to remember, these are Uruguayans. They have no experience in this kind of weather, this kind of snow. It is horrifyingly unimaginable to them that they are in this desperate situation. But several of them, Roberto Canessa, Gustavo Zerbino, they are medical students, although they haven't had a lot of time in medical school. But they take charge and start helping the injured as best they can. One boy has 2 broken legs. Arturo Noguera, who they try to help as best they can. Rafael Evarakin, forgive me if I'm saying it wrong. He had his calf muscle torn around by glass, and it goes around his leg and basically is at the front of his leg. So Zerbino or Canessa take it, put it back in its place, and bandage it with a rugby shirt. Roberto finds Nando Parado, and he sees that he has a fractured skull, and it looks like part of his brain is coming out. He had hit his head. So they move on from him, and they find his mother, Eugenia Parado, who is dead. She died on impact. Nando's younger sister, Susana Parado, she has injuries, internal injuries, and a bloody face. But Roberto does the best he can to make her comfortable before also moving on to the next person. Zerbino gets asked by Enrique Paletero if he can help him with something because he's got a steel or metal pole sticking out of his stomach. And Gustavo's like, he remembers his psychology class where he said, don't let them panic. Don't let your patient panic. So he just tells Platero, listen, you're fine. You're strong as an ox. Just help me with this, okay? And Platero turns to go do what he said. Zerbino grabs the tube, puts his knee against Platero, and pulls it out of him, along with about 6 inches of his intestine. But before Platero can complain or anything, Zerbino tells him, listen, there's a lot more injured people. You need to suck it up and help them. So he ties it off with a rugby shirt and gets to work. Then their team captain, Marcelo Perez, he comes out. He's got a black eye and some injuries, but he's aware. He knows what's going on. He starts organizing everybody he can to move the seats, to move the dead bodies, help the injured. And over the next several hours, they are just moving anything. They're doing everything they can to figure everything out. Several of the players had jumped out into the snow because they thought that the plane might explode. And they see this dot in the distance, and they recognize it as one of their teammates, Carlos Valletta. And he's stumbling around. They try calling to him and trying to go out to him, but they're falling up to their waists in snow. And then all of a sudden he disappears into the snow. Just gone. Finally, there's a lot of screaming. They break into the captain's cabin where they find the dead pilot and they find the Guerra He's bleeding out of his nose. He's got the instrument panel buried in his chest, and he keeps repeating, "We pass Curicó, we pass Curicó," and then he's begging for water. They grab some snow in a handkerchief and put it in his mouth, but it's not helping him enough. And then he begs them to give him his pistol. And being Catholics, they say, we can't help you with that. So, but this is the only information they're going to have for a while, that they've passed Curicó. What they don't know is that they are nowhere near Curicó. Curicó is on the foothills of the Andes Mountains on the Chilean side. They are nowhere near that. They're actually in Argentina in the Andes Mountains. After a while, the sun is setting, and it's getting bitterly, bitterly cold and windy. And so Perez, he gets everybody organized, saying, listen, they're going to come rescue us, but we need to survive the night. So they take as many of the dead bodies as they can and put them in the coldest part of the plane. They build as much of a wall at the entrance of the fuselage, this jagged hole that's been put into it. And they are all crowded around on top of each other with very little room. Like, one movement is basically kicking another person who might be injured. Everybody's piled on top of each other. Perez and another boy, Roy Harley, they stay at the wall that they built out of suitcases and chairs, and they rebuild it whenever it falls, although Roy Harley starts crying every time it falls. And so people are climbing on top of each other some of them are completely dazed, some of them don't realize what's going on, some of them are, I guess you would say, nightmare walking, because it's a nightmare they're in. And then one of the other medical students, who I don't know how much experience he had, but they didn't really count him, I guess, but Diego Storm, he looks over at Nando, who has had his head lying in the snow at the entrance for a while. And he says, I don't think Nando's as bad off as we think. And so him and a few others, they take turns warming up his body while then putting his head back in the snow. And apparently this is what saved his life after he hit his head, which is that when you have a skull fracture and your brain's coming out, the best thing to do with it is extreme cold, almost hypothermic cold. So it keeps your brain from expanding too far and keeps you from dying, basically. But it is a horrible night in that fuselage. At one point, they think several hours have passed. Roberto Canessa looks at his watch. It's 9 o'clock at night. And there's bitter freezing cold. Bitter. They do not have the clothes for this. They do not have anywhere near the gear to deal with cold. And then Roberto comes up with one of his clever ideas, where he sees that every seat has these zippers nylon on them. So they take off these nylons with the zipper and they make them into blankets. Now, they're very poor substitute, but it's better than nothing. And their body heat plus the blankets and anything else they can use is keeping them from dying, basically, of freezing. Although a lot of them are punching each other and hitting each other so that they can keep the blood flowing. So that night passes, and the next morning, 5 more people have died. So that left 28 people still alive on the mountains. And so everybody thinks they're going to be rescued, that there's going to be planes out searching for them now that they've gone missing. And they're right for a moment. For an hour after the plane disappears, the Chileans send out rescue teams to search for them. Search teams, I guess you would say, instead of rescue. And over the next few days, other countries get involved. Argentina, Uruguay, in the search for these people. And actually their grid pattern puts them right where they think they're looking for them. But because the plane has a white roof and the plane itself is completely white and covered in snow and surrounded by snow, they can't see them from the sky. But the boys hold out hope that they're going to be found, especially Marcelo Perez and Pancho Delgado, one of the older boys, who is a law student. And they keep up the boys' spirits with stories and prayer and saying the authorities won't abandon them, God won't abandon them, they'll make it. And Marcelo's confidence is extremely good. But they organize then. They remove more of the dead bodies, they clear more of the fuselage, and they start to figure things out. So they've survived about 24 hours at this point, and they start organizing themselves around their captain. And What they do is they give him all the food that they have left, which they were on a plane to go to Chile over a 2-3 hour flight. So there isn't a lot. There's like 8 chocolate bars, some small jars of jam, a can of sardines, 3 bottles of wine, and half a flask of brandy. And there's 28 healthy people still on the mountains. And so they are rationing very severely, like 1 bar of chocolate a day and a sip of wine from a deodorant camp. That is nothing, especially at this high altitude where you're breathing faster, the cold is causing more energy to be used up. And so they are consuming very, very little. But they're all holding out hope for rescue. And at first, one of their biggest problems besides the cold is water. Even though they're surrounded by snow, when you eat snow, it hurts your mouth, and it also, the cold from the snow causes your body to kind of compress more and send more blood flow to the vital organs than the extremities. So your body is struggling. And they try shaking it in a bottle, but that uses up valuable energy too. So one of them, Vito Strauss, comes up with an ingenious idea. He sees that all the seats have these aluminum metal foils in the back. So he bends them into a foil. He bends the foil into a funnel, and they put the wine bottles beneath them, as well as anything else they can use to capture the water. That is, that the snow gets melted on the foil from the sun. So it's enough to keep their dehydration at bay. So they've solved that one problem of water. And Perez is so impressed by this that he organizes water team. So people will melt water throughout the day and move it so that it's at the best angle of the sun. He also organizes a lot of the younger boys into the cleanup crew, the gang, who will tidy up the fuselage. They've moved the dead bodies out into the snow, and they've removed as many seats and as much of the luggage as they can, not only to rebuild the wall, but they've also taken out the seat cushions to use them as their sleeping spots, and also snowshoes that they start to use. They put luggage straps across them over the cushions around their shoes. And they also put their shoes up so that they aren't, because they need to dry them out during the night. So those boys take care of tidying up the cabin. Roberto, Gustavo Zerbino, and Liliana Methal, the one woman left, they take over as the medical team, although Roberto would not let himself be relegated to one job. So they take over the medical needs of those that are still around, which what they can do isn't much. Susana Parado is still suffering from internal injuries, but Roberto, the best he can do for her is clean up her face and massage her feet with her turning purple. Over the next few days, they have adapted enough to build a tiny society around surviving this until rescue comes. But days go by. They think they see one plane dip its wings when it passes them. They see other planes or they hear other planes and helicopters, but if they can't see the planes, they know they aren't seen. But they think they see one plane dip its wings at them. And so Roberto and a few others celebrate by chugging nearly half a bottle of wine, and that somebody steals some pieces of chocolate that nobody knows who did it, but they're all so angry about that. But a lot of them are starting to question after a few days, if the plane saw us, why haven't they dropped supplies? Why haven't they done anything, it seems? And Perez and Delgado, they try to keep everybody calm and hopeful by telling them, listen, if they did drop supplies, they would just sink into the snow. The people know this. They could probably be sending a land rescue instead of planes because we're so stuck here. But they keep giving them all these reasons. But some of the boys, like Roberto, Fito, they start to become more pessimistic or realistic in their minds. And Roberto, Fito, Carlitos Paez, one of the youngest, and Numa Turcati, they decide they're going to try and walk up the hill of the mountain, up this hill, up this mountain, and try to see what they can see. But they are so weak that every few feet they have to stop and take a breath. They only get a few hundred feet up the mountain before they just have to stop. They can't go any further. They are exhausted. They can't believe it. It's just hard, hard, hard. Oh, on the third day on the mountain, Nando Parado wakes up from a coma. And the first thing he sees is Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino and Diego Storm. And they are asking him, wake up, Nando, wake up. We crashed, Nando, we crashed. And so Nando, the first thing he asks is about his mother. And Roberto just tells him straight up, she's dead, but you need to look after your sister. She's still injured. And Nando, after 3 days in a coma, gets up and walks over to Susana, and he starts taking care of her. But again, there's very little he can do. He gives her the food that he can. He gives her the wine. But there is nothing they can do. She's dying, and he knows this. And he becomes obsessed with getting out of the mountains. And he tells Carlitos, I'm going to walk out of here. I'm going to get back to my father. And Carlitos tells him, listen, you'll die of cold. And he's like, not if I wear enough clothes. Then you'll starve to death. You can't walk up the mountain on a piece of chocolate and a sip of wine. And Nando says, then I'll cut some meat off the pilot. After all, they got us into this mess. And Carlitos doesn't take him seriously at that moment, because who would think of doing that? But gradually, as more time goes on, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, the food's running out. And I think it's fear that drives this more than the actual hunger. But apparently when the body is in starvation mode, where it starts eating itself, a shot of fear, of adrenaline, goes through the mind that tells you need to find food. So fear is driving these boys to try and find anything edible. They tear apart this plane as much as they can without destroying it, looking for food. They try to take this, they try to eat the cotton in the seat cushions. They try to eat leather, but they realize it just makes them sicker. They try anything they can. They try to eat some of the makeup that they find. Like, I think it was like, I forget what kind of, like some kind of powder, but it doesn't work, obviously. They find this soil on the side of a mountain called lichen, but it tasted like soil, and it was as a food source, it had no nutrients. It was useless. The only thing surrounding them was rocks, plastic, and snow. And so after several days of no food left, basically no food, like Nando said, he made a chocolate covered peanut last 3 days, and that's when they ran out. A lot of the boys start realizing that the only food source nearby are the dead bodies of their friends. And many of them shy away from this at first, but they start to confide in those that they believe will hear them out, or their closest friends. And by the 9th or 10th day, I believe it was the 10th, Roberto comes out and basically calls a meeting, and he says, listen, there is no food up here. We are still waiting on rescue, and we need to eat if we're going to survive. And the only food is the dead bodies of our friends. And there's just this horror that goes through everybody. They're like, we can't believe we're facing this decision. But they all listen to Roberto, because not only as a medical student, he understands that the protein in the meat will keep them alive, but that he's a very earnest in his religious belief. That he tells them, listen, the only thing left is a carcass. The soul has left the body. There is nothing wrong with what we're doing any more than eating the dead cattle that we have at home. And everybody asks, well, one person says, well, why would God do this to us? Why would he make us face this? And Zerbino, he says, listen, what would our friends think? The ones that have already died. What would they say? If it was them in this position, they'd say that they would want us to do the same thing. And so eventually the boys all make a pact that if one of them dies, their bodies can be used as food. Some of them, Marcelo and Pancho Delgado, they still have their people who support them, But a lot of the younger boys are now angry at them because it's like, you promised us something and there's nothing coming. But somebody like Liliana Manthal and her husband Javier Methol, they both understand that there's nothing wrong with what the boys are doing, that it's not wrong, but that they physically themselves cannot do it. It's just, they can't. It's just a human revulsion. And others kind of agree. But eventually, everyone agrees that it's not wrong to do it, that God won't condemn them to hell for this because their moral duty is to survive. And the only way to survive is to eat the dead. So, Roberto, Gustavo Zerbino, Daniel Mespons, and Fito Strauss go out there. They uncover the snow from one of the buttocks of the bodies. And using a penknife and some glass carved into a knife, Roberto cuts away about 20 matchstick-sized strips of meat and puts it on the roof of the fuselage to dry in the sun. And he goes in and he lets everyone know there's food on the roof. Anybody who feels like they can or wants to eat can go there. At first, no one moves. Then Roberto, to show his willingness, his stubborn will, and his urge to survive, he goes out there, grabs a piece, hesitates, his revulsion fighting with his stubborn will, as he says, and then slowly puts it in his mouth and swallows it. And he says he felt an immense calm at that point because he had chosen to live. Others follow along, going, and a few boys do eat. But a few hold back, whether from revulsion or just the sheer horror. Unfortunately for Nando, he had lost his sister the day before. Susana had died the day before, and he had buried her. And he asked the boys that his mother and his sister's bodies be separated, that they not be eaten. And they all agreed. The next day, the day 10 or 11, Roy Harley and Marcelo Perez listen in on this transistor radio they had found where they could hear the news coming in, although they couldn't get a signal out. They used like an extended antenna to hear things. And at the end of one broadcast, they hear that the search for them, the official search, has been canceled due to negative results. And that nobody could survive up there after the crash and after 8 days in the freezing cold. Everyone has been given up for dead. Roy is overwhelmed with how horrifying this is, starts sobbing, tells Marcelo exactly what he heard, and Marcelo breaks down sobbing. He just cannot believe this. Everything he had hoped for, everything he knew about the world around him had just been shattered. God had turned on them. The authorities had abandoned them. Everything that he needed to be true had just gone away. At that moment, his leadership of the group just became automatic and empty. Like, he did not believe they could get out of there. Pancho Delgado, same thing. He did not believe they could get out of there on their own. And he slithered into the background. But others were not surprised by this news. Like Nando, Fito, Roberto, they were not shocked. And but one boy, Gustavo Nikolic, when he heard the news, he told them that we have to tell everybody. And so he gets everybody in the fuselage together and he says, listen, we just heard on the radio, it's good news. They called off the search. And Carlitos, everybody just starts yelling at him. Like, Carlitos says, how the hell is that good news? And he says, because it means we're going to get out of here on our own. And his bravery is what kept them from completely panicking. Nando is like telling everybody, I'm going to walk out of here right now. I'm leaving. But others, especially Marcelo, persuade him, listen, you've just come out of a coma. You've barely eaten. If you do this, you're going to die for sure. But they do organize 3 boys, Gustavo Zerbino, Daniel Mespons, and Numa Turcati, to go on a small expedition to look for the tail. And they do, but they misjudge the distance that they walk. So they actually find themselves too far away from the plane to return that night, so they huddle together during the night in like a small hole or behind some rocks, and they nearly freeze to death. Like, the cold was so intense that if they didn't start punching each other every few seconds, they were going to die of cold. And they barely make it through the night. They find a few bodies. Zerbino takes their personal items and like necklaces, their money, wallets, and brings them back to the plane with him when the three of them turn around. But it's so bad that Mespons doesn't notice that his shoe has come off from the numbness. Gustavo can barely see because his sunglasses broke at the nose, and he kept doing this, peering over them. And there's this thing called snow blindness, where the sun's UV rays reflect off the white snow into your eyes and burns them. So long periods of doing that is like staring at the sun itself. So he's almost completely blind at this point. By the time the three of them get back, they are haggard, they are hurt. Everybody brings them some food. They are a mess. Like, everybody realizes, look, the three of the strongest boys were nearly killed after one night. Finally, they all hunker down for another few days while they start to get back into a routine. But that's the first 24 hours and the first 10 days of their time in the Andes Mountains. So that's the end of part 2. We will return with part 3, where we will cover day 17 up to finding the tail. So thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for part 3, my friends.